Welcome to this training video provided by the European Commission DG Taxud for complementing the series of e-learning material for the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. In this training, we will show you how to use the communication template provided by the Commission for calculation of the embedded emissions of CBAM goods by the producers of such goods. Please note that the use of this template is voluntary. However, as you will see in this video, the template is a powerful tool that helps you in complying with the CBAM. Its use can therefore be considered best practice. Who should watch this video? The operators of installations producing CBAM goods. You should become familiar with the process of filling the template. Importers of CBAM goods, you should learn to find the data you need for your reporting in the results presented in the template. Potential verifiers. At this point in time, verification is purely voluntary. However, if you intend to provide the service of CBAM verification in the future, you should start building up your competence by learning the concepts you need to establish the verification process. And finally, competent authorities in the EU, you should learn to interpret the data presented using the template. What will you learn in the next hour? We will start by reminding you where to find information in the EU CBAM in general. Then we will give you guidance on general features of the template, but the central part of the training will be a step-by-step demonstration on how to enter data into the template. For this, we use two examples: an integrated steelwork with blast furnace using the bubble approach, and the production of high alloy steel using several purchased precursors. During the demonstration, we will also show where the importer can find the information necessary for the quarterly CBAM report. First, and most important for any situation in which you are looking for information on the CBAM, there is one website operated by the European Commission, a one-stop shop presenting you not only all the relevant legislation and training material, but also the entry point to the CBAM Transitional Registry, which is the IT system by which the importers of CBAM goods have to submit their quarterly CBAM reports. Also very important for the purpose of this training, on this website, under the given hyperlink, you will find the guidance document for non-EU operators of installations, i.e. the producers of CBAM goods. The examples which we show you in this video are described in high detail in Chapter 7 of that guidance document. Before we start the demonstration of the CBAM communication template, let us have a quick look at the methodology to determine the embedded emissions of CBAM goods. We do this in a step-by-step approach in the same sequence as we will then demonstrate the use of the template. For more detailed information, Section 6.2 of the guidance document for operators should be consulted. Step 1. The operator has to define the installation boundaries and the boundaries of the production processes. By production process, we mean the system boundaries of the emissions that belong to each aggregated goods category, as defined in Annex 2 of the CBAM Implementing Act. A choice is then to be made if non-CBAM products are produced in the installation. The related emissions can be voluntarily monitored too, or their attributed emissions are to be subtracted from the installation's total emissions. Step 2, the operator monitors the greenhouse gas emissions of the installation. As a step 2A, we have to mention also the electricity consumption of the installation needs to be monitored. for determining indirect emissions. During the transitional phase, this is mandatory for all CBAM goods. Now, in step 3, the installation's total emissions need to be split. We call that attributed to the relevant production processes. This needs some special rules. For example, where heat is not directly produced inside the production process, or where heat is exported from the process, the respective heat flows and associated emissions have to be taken into account appropriately. Also, where so-called waste gases, like for example blast furnace gas, are imported to or exported from the production process, corrections to the attributed emissions need to be applied. Indirect emissions from electricity use or corrections due to electricity export need to be taken into account as well. At this point, it is essential to recall that the concept of embedded emissions is different from a carbon footprint. In the CBAM, imported heat belongs to the direct emissions and consumed electricity counts for indirect emissions. The only other relevant element known from carbon footprints is the addition of embedded emissions of precursors as relevant for step 4. However, for the purpose of the CBAM, only exactly defined precursors need to be taken into account. They are identified in Annex 2 of the Implementing Act and are always CBAM goods themselves. Other emissions, for example, transport emissions, are not covered. For more details on this topic, please read carefully section 6.2 of the guidance document. Now coming to step 4. Here, the embedded emissions of precursors are added to the attributed emissions of the process. The operator needs to take into account both purchased precursors and precursors produced in the same installation. Now, the attributed emissions of the process are divided by its activity level, the production output. This results in the specific embedded emissions of the good, which is in fact the tons of CO2 equivalents per ton of product. Finally, step 6 is optional. The operator may collect and report data on a carbon price already paid for the embedded emissions, or at least for a part of the embedded emissions. This slide gives you an overview of the 6 steps I just explained. This table can serve for you as a reference to where each step needs entries in the template. And secondly, where you can find more explanations in the guidance document mentioned earlier.
Before we start talking about the content, how to fill the template, here's a short introduction to the template's features. Before we talk about the feature itself, here a little bit of background information about the version management of the template. The training that you just hear is held with respect to version 2.1 that is published on 14th May of 2024. It might happen that over time there will be newer versions uploaded there because we want to take into account any errors that have been reported or based on experience how we can improve the user friendliness, but we don't expect that any of the forthcoming changes will have a significant impact on what you've learned in this presentation. So speaking about the features of the templates, how does it look? How does it feel? Here you have an example table as it will show throughout the template later on. It has yellow cells. Those indicate that data entries are mandatory here in order to make the results work and the template work properly. Then you can see there are also light yellow cells. Those indicate that entries are optional. You may provide information there, but it's not necessary to obtain final results in the template. And then there are green cells. Those are output cells. They contain formulae, and as you see, error messages, calculation results, and so on. And in this particular case on that screen, you see those green cells indicate that something is incomplete as an error message, or that information is missing and something needs to be done in the yellow cells to be completed in order to make the template work properly. Then there are also other conditional formatting in the template. As you can see on this screen, for example, under section F, the indicator says something is false, as it is a yellow cell that has been entered by the operator as false, and as a consequence, certain sections will be conditionally grayed out to support the operator with not having to bother any further with those sections as they are not relevant for this specific installation. Further to that, all of the sheets in the template contain hyperlinks. Some of them are directly in the text, but on each sheet you will find in the header hyperlinks to the table of contents, to further guidance, which is contained in the template that helps you identifying what really needs to be entered for the individual parameters. There is always a link to the summary of process sheet and to the summary of products. And as you can see on the screen as well, there is also conditional hyperlinks that are customized or specific for the specific sheet, as we'll talk about later on. Then the sheets containing information about the production processes and about the purchase precursors, those contain also some further indicators to help you guide you through the template. A green cell indicates that an entry is required and it has been successfully completed. Red does indicate that an entry is required, but the cell is yet empty and needs to be filled and completed. And white, similar to the conditional formatting of graying out, indicates that in principle an entry could be relevant, but because of previous entry, it's not relevant here, so you don't need to worry about it. A further general feature of the template, some tables will contain in bright gray color font examples at the data at the top of some tables. Those are not used for calculation, but should help you, guide you how to complete the specific sections, such as in this table. We will speak about that when we speak about the filling in the template a little bit in more detail, but there are some sections, some tables that contain such example data. For the general structure, so we don't have to show the template itself, the first 4 sheets of the template contain useful information, most prominently the guidelines and conditions, which contain information you have just learned. And there are other sheets on the version management, a table of contents, and a list of codes regarding the codes for the CN codes of the products, of the CBAM goods, of the country codes, and of currencies. Then the sheets in capital letters from A to E are the ones where you as the operator have to enter information. And then there are further sheets, in particular what the summary sheets at the very bottom, which calculates the results. And at the very bottom, you see the summary communication. This is all the information or summary of all the information that needs to be passed on from the operator of an installation to the importer who has to report when importing the goods into the EU. But before we continue with the template, an introduction to the example of an integrated steelwork.
The first example that we want to demonstrate is the one described in section 7221 of the guidance document for operators. It is an integrated steel plant, meaning a relatively complex installation consisting of the typical processes of such a plant: a coke oven, sinter plant, one or more blast furnaces, oxygen steel making, and several downstream processes for obtaining diverse steel products such as sheets, bars, rails, etc. For such complex installations, it is common to use a calculation-based approach, the so-called mass balance approach, for monitoring. The first thing is to describe the installation and its processes in the template. For determining the relevant items, we start by listing the production processes and their logical and/or physical connections by material flow. Then we add the related products and check which of them are CBAM goods. We see on the right side that all outputs of the downstream and forming processes fall into the same aggregated goods category, iron and steel products. We then assign system boundaries to these processes, which gives us 4 production processes as shown. Furthermore, we must not forget that in such installations, usually the waste gases are used in a power plant or for other heat-consuming processes. In this case, we can consider the production of electricity as a virtual production process, which we do not further consider for filling the template. And then we also discard the production of coke. While the use of coke will lead to emissions in the steel plant, coke itself is not a CBAM good and therefore not a precursor. The emissions from production of coke, i.e. the embedded emissions of coke, are disregarded. Finally, before we look into the filling of the template, we recall that there is a powerful option for simplification allowed by the CBAM Implementing Act. Where an installation produces its own precursors, and these precursors are not sold or used for production processes outside the installation, several processes can be joined to form one bigger production process. We call that a bubble approach. In order to make the example manageable, we use this approach in this training. If you have questions about this approach, please consult the relevant section of the guidance document for operators found on the Commission's website.
And now we start filling in together the template, starting from an empty template and starting with sheet capital A. So we're not going to show you the sheets 0 versions, A contents, guidelines and conditions and code lists, but those you should read carefully before starting filling the template. The first information you need to provide here is the reporting period. So this means the time period for which all the embedded remissions to the CBAM goods that you want to export to the EU refer to. In the best case, ideally that refers to the emissions that occurred during 1 calendar year. So let's, for example, start with the 1st January of 2023 until the end 31st of December 2023. The first thing that you see is upon entry, sections in the header turned red. That indicates that those sections have not been completed yet. For example, the reporting period. So we need to enter that the reference period for reporting embedded emissions had to end sometime, which is the 31st of December 2023 in that case. And once you enter that, you see that the red color for the reporting period vanishes. So that means that first section has been completed correctly. The second part concerns the installation and how to identify your installations. As you may remember, yellow cells indicate that an entry is mandatory because this information will be passed on to the importer, and light yellow cells you may enter optionally. Without further ado and not to waste time, this is an administrative part and I will not go into details, but I will show you the pre-filled template. So this is how the completed section would look like, for example. Scrolling further down in that sheet, you see that it asks you to provide information about the verifier of the report. But what you also see is that this information is contained in yellow, in light yellow, which means it's optional. So for the time being, this is only relevant in case you use an external auditor, which is called a verifier of that report, and is not mandatory during the transitional period of the CBAM. The next thing you see in the header at the top is that the next step is the goods and precursors which have yet to be completed. So you can click on that link and you see you'll be guided to the next section. And here is the first time we have to enter specific technical information about the installation. What you have to enter here is to list all aggregated goods that are produced within the installation. So that is important here, regardless of how you want to report and split it into production processes, all relevant CBAM goods that are produced in your installations have to be listed here. So as you see in the small window is the flow diagram. So what we want to enter here is the products that you produce. From the drop-down list in the file, you see all CBAM goods that are relevant, not just the ones for your sector, and you have select the relevant ones. So firstly, you have to select the sintered ore. Secondly, you have to select the pig iron production. Thirdly, you have to select the crude steel. And finally, the CBAM good that is put on the market are iron and steel products. Two things are important here. One, it doesn't matter in which order you list them here. And secondly, you see based on the entries on the right-hand side for the production routes, all of a sudden certain cells became mandatory to be entered. While for sintered ore and iron or steel products, all production routes are included. For pig iron and for crude steel, you have to select through which production route those products are produced. Again, you have here a drop-down list that is conditionally filled with information that is relevant for the specific CBAM good. So for example, for the pig iron, in this example, as shown in the window, it's the blast furnace route that needs to be selected here. And for the production of crude steel, it's the basic oxygen steel making that you have to select. Before you really complete that section and consider it done, you may want to take a look at the automatic fields here, which shows you relevant precursors. Because of the entries you made, the template will automatically show you what are within the scope of CBAM the relevant precursors, which are crude steel, direct reduced iron, pig iron, any alloy material, sintered ore, or hydrogen. If any of that material is relevant for that production process, then you have to make sure it's listed here if it's within the installation or further down below under purchased precursors if relevant. If one of those products is not relevant for the production process, then you're done. This is just a check for you to check for completeness whether you have omitted an entry. The next step is how do you want to report those production processes? So please carefully, in this case, read the guidance document or the guidance text here and the appropriate and according guidance text in section 7.2 that shows you how you can cluster and split the process into production processes. As we've shown in the example, which you see in the window, we want to apply a bubble approach here. The bubble approach means you want to select from the list only the one CBAM good that is put on the market. You see that the drop-down list here is populated only with entries that are relevant for the specific installation as selected under point E. The only CBAM good that is put on the market are iron and steel products, so we select them here. The first thing you should now notice is the completeness check, which indicates that something is missing. So you have to make sure that all CBAM goods that are listed under A are assigned to a production process here. So what we want to do in order to indicate that we want to apply a bubble approach is to say that the production process iron and steel products includes sintered ore, includes pig iron, and includes crude steel. And you see the error message disappears, which means you have successfully indicated that you want to apply a bubble approach. The last thing here is the template asks you to enter a name. This name is just for internal purposes because you will see it throughout the template that it refers to that production process. So you may want to call it simply the bubble approach. The next step here is to look at the purchased precursors to scroll further down below. Those will be relevant in the second example we will show later on, but they're not relevant for this example, which means at this stage you have completed sheet A of the template.
This slide is meant to remind you quickly of the three main monitoring approaches foreseen by the CBAM Implementing Act. The details about these methods, which are also the methods used by the EU ETS installations, can be found in the guidance document. For the example demonstration, we use the mass balance method, the middle of the three examples, methodologies, in which for each fuel and material entering or leaving the installation, the quantity times its carbon content are summed up, multiplied by the mass ratio of CO2 and carbon, and thereby resulting in the CO2 emissions as given in the formula here. For checking the completeness of the approach, nothing is better than looking into the process flowchart. Here we see all the fuels and materials relevant for the calculation, giving rise to CO2 emissions. Regarding the emissions from burning the waste gases in the power plant, specific rules apply at a later stage when the so-called attributed emissions of the production process are calculated. From point of view of the whole installation, those emissions are already included without gaps or double counting if the mass balance is calculated as shown. These are the data that you may recognize as coming from the example in the guidance document. We will now show you how to enter them in the template.
And this can be done in sheet B of the template. You see here the empty template, and in order to show you how it works, we will start filling in together a couple of source streams to show you how the template will guide you through. Generally speaking, as shown in the slides, this template and this sheet of this will allow you to enter the source streams either via a calculation-based approach, which is the first table. If you select the drop-down list, you can see this is the differentiation between combustion emissions, process emissions, and the mass balance. And further down below is for the perfluorocarbon emissions, which are relevant for the aluminum industry, or emission sources in case the installation monitors the emissions directly in the stack. But for the sake of simplicity, in this training, we just want to focus on the first part. What you can see here is a big table with a lot of abbreviations in the header. This is a good example to show you how you can make best use of the guidance that is included in the template. You see here at the top that there is the link to that further guidance. And also here in the header above of the table, you see a link that guides you to the further guidance. So if you click on that link, the template will jump to another sheet. This is the sheet G, further guidance, where you get a detailed instruction for all parameters, how they are defined and how they should be completed. Once you are done, you can either use as normal in Excel, jump back to sheet B, or you use the hyperlink at the top or the bottom of this further guidance table, which will direct you again back to the relevant section in sheet B. So for example, let's fill it together for a standard case of combustion of fuels and see the template upon selection will automatically show you which cells are relevant for this specific type of monitoring. And as you see in these examples above, what you would enter is here, for example, heavy fuel oil. And you would enter activity data expressed in the units you want to report them as. So for example, as we show here above, let's report it in tons of heavy fuel oil that have been consumed during the reporting period. The next step is to enter the net calorific value, but you see for the time being that this is optional. So let's move on with the emission factor. And for the emission factor, it depends in the drop-down list for the unit of the emission factor, whether you want to report it as ton CO2 per energy content or per ton of material. If you want to report it per ton of material, you don't need to worry about the NCV, it's still optional. But if you want to report it per terajoules, per energy content, then the net calorific becomes a mandatory input. So let's fill it as shown in the example. And if you scroll to the right, you will see a couple of further factors. Most prominently, the biomass content, which would be 0 for heavy fuel oil, but just for sake of example of showing you what the result will be, let's use, for example, 10% of that specific fuel are from biomass. Then you would be done with this specific source stream, and you can scroll to the right side of the table to see the summary, which will show you the total fossil emissions of that specific source stream, the total biomass emissions of that specific source stream, the fossil energy content expressed as terajoule, and the energy content of the biomass fraction also expressed as terajoules. If you scroll again to the left and want to add a further source streams, again, we use an arbitrary example just for the sake of showing it to you. If we use process emissions are found where it's not the primary purpose of energy consumption or for energy generation of a specific source stream, or most prominently when you have mineralic materials such as raw meal for cement clinker production. In this case, you would enter the raw meal for the cement clinker. Again, report the amounts that are consumed in tons. And the emission factor, in this case, there is no other way than reporting in ton CO2 per ton, as there is no energy content, and you would report here the amount of ton CO2 that arise upon decomposition of the raw meal clinker. And again, I don't want to show you for the sake of time, but if you scroll to the right, you can see for yourself that the emissions will be again shown automatically. So this is the general example, but I've already pre-filled for you for the specific example of the iron and steel installation. So let's continue with the pre-filled example. So as you have seen on the previous slide, and you see in the small window, this is how to enter for the specific example of the mass balance all input material that go into the installation and the production process, and all material that leaves the installation and contains carbon. So to give you an example here above, the coke fines, that would mean that 50,000 tons of coke fines have been consumed by the production process during the relevant reporting period. You see on the right side, instead of the emission factor, the carbon content is relevant for the mass balance. So what is the amount of ton of carbon included per ton of coke fine? This is done for all the materials that contain carbon and are entering the production process. For those products that contain carbon and leave the installation, those values should be entered as negative values. That means as steel is the product of the installation, 4.8 million tons of steel are leaving the installation with a carbon content. So this is the carbon content in the steel of 0.0018 ton of carbon per ton of steel. And again, if we scroll to the right-hand side of the table, you see that input material is shown here as emissions entering the installation, whereas materials or products leaving the installations are then deducted again. And the difference between the emissions entering and the emissions leaving the installations are then the emissions of the installation. And at that stage, you have finished entering sheet B of the template.
The next step is the determination of indirect emissions. During the transitional phase, that means for goods imported into the EU until the 31st December of 2025, it is mandatory to report indirect emissions for all CBAM goods. Again, we start by looking at the process flow chart. We see the production of electricity and assume that it will be used mostly inside the installation itself. For the determination of the emission factor of this electricity produced from waste gases, special rules apply, which you can take from the guidance document for operators. However, it is typical that also electricity from the grid is consumed. Therefore, a weighted average emission factor for the total electricity consumed in the installation needs to be determined. For the determination of that weighted emission factor, the template cannot be used. This must be done outside the template in a separate calculation. Finally, the electricity can be used for calculation of indirect emissions in all the relevant production processes. The template will help here in particular in assigning the indirect emissions from precursors in the same way as for the direct emissions.
And this leads us to sheet C, emissions and energy at the installation level, which summarizes the fuel balance of the installation and the greenhouse gas emissions balance. The first table here, you see there is a lot of information being extracted automatically indicated by the green cells. The total fuel input is taken automatically from the entries we've made together in sheet B. So it's the sum of all source streams that have been listed there. You see, in addition to that, you're asked to attribute the fuel for the production of CBAM goods, fuel for the production of electricity, and also in case any parts of the fuel that are consumed by the installation are used for the production of non-CBAM goods. So here, for the sake of example, the table has been pre-filled, and importantly, if for whatever reason entries in sheet B are incomplete or you want to overwrite them for other reasons, you can always do this. So if the 74,270 calculated automatically there are not complete yet because there are source streams which you cannot enter in the way you've entered in sheet B, you can manually overwrite them. So for the sake of example, if the actual emissions were 75,000 terajoules of energy that is consumed, you see here that that would be overridden. And on the right-hand side, for completeness check, you would now see that 700 terajoules have not yet been attributed. But it was just for example. In our example, we've have correctly filled in sheet B, so we don't need to overwrite anything. Which leads us to the subsection 2 on the greenhouse gas balance. Again, you see a lot of information can be extracted automatically from entries in sheet B, such as the total CO2 emissions. As you remember, in a mass balance, that's the difference between the ingoing source streams, and the emissions of the outgoing source streams are deducted. So here we have the summary of the total CO2 emissions, the total biomass emissions, and in case relevant for other production sectors which are not relevant for iron and steel, N2O emissions and perfluorocarbon emissions. And as you see, there's a lot of light yellow cells, but there is one particular yellow cell which requires mandatory input from you, which are the total indirect emissions. And remember, indirect emissions refer to emissions from electricity only with respect to the scope of the CBAM. Further down below, you're asked about the general information about data quality and the quality assurance. So how has the emissions data been acquired? Again, you have a drop-down list to simplify entries for you. Is it mostly measurements and analysis? Were any emission factors used as standard factors, either from national sources, sector-specific, international data, or did you use mostly default values provided by the European Commission? In our example, we select it was national standard factors. If this is the case, the justification for the use of default values is not relevant here because we haven't used those default values used by the Commission. That would turn yellow in case we use these default values. In this case, you would have to provide a justification, whether it's unreasonable costs for more accurate monitoring, whether there are data gaps or any other reasons. In order to be sure what you have to enter there, again, please carefully read the guidance document. And last but not least, you're asked about information on the quality assurance. Did the data compiled here undergo third-party verification, so an independent audit by a third party? Did it undergo at least internal auditing, so independent people from other units, or the 4I principle, or were you the only one filling in the template? And once you've completed that, you're done with sheet C of the communication template.
We approach now step number 3, to attribute the emissions to the relevant production processes. Both the EU ETS and the CBAM in the Implementing Act use the calculation formula shown here. Attributed direct emissions of the production process are calculated by first taking the direct emissions determined using the installation level methods, which are the emissions caused by fuels and process materials or measured continuously, which fit to the boundaries of the process. That is the first term of the formula. Where heat is imported from other installations or production processes, or where heat is centrally provided from a boiler or CHP plant to several processes, these heat amounts are not included in this first term of direct emissions. Instead, the next two terms in the calculation concern the corrections for imports of heat, as just mentioned, or for subtracting exported heat-related emissions in order to avoid double counting. The same applies to the two terms needed for correction for imports or exports of waste gases, although these terms are calculated differently than those for the heat. Finally, if electricity is generated inside the production process, e.g. by expansion turbines, a correction term needs to be subtracted from the attributed emissions. All those necessary inputs can be made in the sheet D processes in the template. For the exact meaning of each of the variables and how to determine them, for this formula, please consult the guidance document for operators. Step number 4 now requires that for complex goods, the embedded emissions of their precursors are added. Secondly, for determining the specific embedded emissions, the attributed emissions need to be divided by the amount of goods produced. That is the activity level. For that purpose, this activity level needs to be determined in line with the rules of the CBAM Implementing Act. It is then entered in sheet D processes in the template. The variable EE input material, so the embedded emissions of the input material, consists of the mass consumed of each precursor and the specific embedded emissions SEE of each precursor. So the mass is the variable MI. The MI input is in sheet D processes, while the precursors SEE are defined in sheet E purchased precursors, but only in the case they are actually purchased. If the precursor is produced inside the installation, the template automatically uses the data defined in the production process of the precursor. When those inputs are done, the template displays the final SEE result of the complex good in the sheet summary processes.
And this is really where the inputs in the template are very important that you do it correctly. As you remember the step 1, when we split the production of the installation to the production processes, you automatically say that there shall not be any gaps or double counting between production processes, which also has the consequence that all of the emissions that we have reported in the previous sheets shall only be assigned and attributed to one single production process. This is easy when you apply the bubble approach, as you only have one production process, but please bear with me when we discuss the second example later on, that this will be of key importance. And here I want to guide you through how to fill the template for the production processes, starting with the production of iron and steel products that are produced. As you see in the example in the guidance document, also in the small window, the total production of iron and steel products during the reporting period amounted to 4.8 million tons of iron and steel products that are produced by the installation. And as you see here, this is not just for information, this is one of the key parameters that are used for the attributed emissions and later on for calculating the embedded emissions of the product, because this will be the denominator of the specific embedded emissions. As a next step, you see that you still have to enter something, entered and indicated by the red color on the red side, on the right-hand side, which are the amounts that are produced for the market. In this case, it is simple, since all of that is produced for the market and not for the processed into further products, we can use simple Excel functions and indicate that this is the same as we have here on top and click enter. And once this is done, you see it's green and it indicates that the total amount of produced iron and steel products are produced for the market. If we scroll further down, you see that there are a couple of further information. This is the enumerator of the specific embedded emissions, which is, as you've just saw on the slides, the attributed emissions. So all of the emissions that we've just reported before need to be attributed to the production process. Before we don't do this, the cell at the top will not cease to be red, and also the indicators on the right-hand side will remain to be red. The first thing the template asks you in order to facilitate is any measurable heat or any waste gases relevant? And for this specific example, it's of crucial importance that you understand these concepts. What is meant by measurable heat and what are waste gases? What you should do and what can help you is to click on the link above again, which guides you to the sheet with the further guidance. and also to read carefully the respective section in the guidance documents to understand the concept of attributing emissions as just explained before. And please be aware that this is the same thing that has to be done by installations in the EU, and these are accordingly priced their carbon emissions based on exactly this attribution of emission. A further feature of the template you may not have seen in previous sheets is that there are some true-false indicators. Don't be concerned about that you don't know this language. I use a German version of Excel, so it shows me true and false in German language, but this will always be using the language setting that you are using. If you use the English version, you would use and see here true and false. I select false here because it is not relevant. And as you've seen, the section on import and export of measurable heat is grayed out and not relevant. As you've seen in the example presented on the slides, and you still see on the screen, waste gases are relevant and need to be filled in here. The next thing is to attribute the directly attributable emissions. And as you see in the example in the table that is shown in the small window, these amount to 7.866044 million tons of CO2 of directly attributable emissions. The next step is to attribute emissions associated with import and export of waste gases. As you see in the flow diagram, waste gases are not imported by the production process, but they are produced and exported to the connected power plant. And as you see again in the table, those are 12,800 terajoules of waste gases that are exported. Optionally, you can enter the emission factor of that waste gas, but as indicated by the green color, the way the attributed emissions are calculated, they don't require you to use that as a default value for the emission factor is used. So please consult for that the guidance document. The last steps are to attribute the indirect emissions related to the electricity consumption within the system boundaries of that production process in that specific reporting year. Again, we look at the table, which tells us it's 1.658844 million megawatt hours that have been consumed during the reporting period. The next thing to convert those megawatt hours into emissions is to enter the corresponding emission factor. Again, if you look it up, it's 0.589 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. The last thing for the indirect emissions is to enter the respective source where you obtained the emission factor from. There you have a list with a lot of abbreviations. Again, if you click at the top of the table the link to the further guidance, this will explain to you in further detail what lies behind each of these abbreviations. Also, further information can be found in the guidance document. As usual, it will ask you whether these emission factors that you've entered relate to default values, installation-specific figures. Is it the emission factor of the grid, or is it, as you see here, for example, is it a mix? It might be a mix of electricity consumed for the grid and electricity produced on-site. In such case, you would select a mix of different sources. And last but not least, as you've heard, we need to report the electricity exported from the production process, which is not the case. We don't export electricity from the production process. We export waste gases, but the production process itself does not export electricity. This is by definition here the case, as no electricity is produced within the production process, but outside the production process. So what you have to do is just to enter 0 here, and on the right-hand side, the indicator will become green. The red color at the top has vanished, which means you have now successfully completed sheet D of the template. And now we can move on to the sheet summary of production processes. Because there are no further entries required at this stage, we do not have any purchase precursors. So with the description and entries with respect to the production processes, we are done. What does this sheet summary processes tell you? It's a summary that is first and foremost a summary for you as the operator of the installation to check for completeness and to check for consistency. So at the top, you will just see the summary of your administrative information, the information regarding the reporting period, and the information regarding a summary of the production processes, summarizing again that you are producing certain aggregated goods in your installation, and you applied a bubble approach, which comprises all other CBAM goods that are produced within the installation. On top of that, as additional information, you have open text format that allows you to report to the importer into the EU any information about the carbon price instrument that is relevant, but we will leave that for later, or any other additional information that you want to pass on to the importer, but I will show you also that a bit later down the road. The next section, if you scroll further down below, you see the summary of the greenhouse gas emissions balance over the installation, summarizing the directly attributable emissions, emissions associated with the heat import and export. Since this is not relevant here, emissions are 0. The amount of emissions that are to be deducted because of the special rules for waste gases that are exported, and the summary, the sum of the total direct emissions as the sum of the previous 3 columns, which will be used as the attributed emissions for calculating the embedded emissions. For calculating the indirect embedded emissions, you see here the almost 1 million tons of CO2, which are the result of the electricity that is consumed multiplied with the specific electricity emission factor that has been entered. And to cap things off, at the right-hand side, you see the activity level. So these are the total production figures of that production process, which shows that a total of 4.8 million tons of iron steel have been produced. So the 7.4 million tons of CO2 and the 4.8 million tons of iron and steel, the quotient of those two, they will comprise the specific embedded emissions. And to check for completeness, you see here how do those figures match with the installation's total emissions. And here's already a good example where you see a difference. So 6% is the deviation between the total emissions of the installations and the attributed emissions. And you may first think, well, then I have done something wrong. But no, you have not, because of the waste gas emissions, and those are calculated with a different emission factor because of the special rules. A deviation is in fact correct here. So don't be put off by any figure different from 0 here. By default, it might be an indicator that it's not consistent, but it shows you that it's important to understand the rules if this is really indicative of a problem or indicative that you have done everything correctly. Next, further down below, you see a summary of the specific embedded emissions of all relevant production processes and all purchase precursors of the installation. This is simply now the summary of the above. Since we have just the bubble approach, all the specific embedded emissions and the specific embedded emissions over the whole process are all the same, and we can move on further to the specific details at the production process level. Here you see a summary again, for which you will ask, why does it look so similar as above? I will show you in the next example how useful this detailed information can be for making sure you've entered everything correctly without any gaps or double counting. So at this stage, you are done with checking completeness and consistency with summary processes sheet. Now, the last thing you have to do in the template is to collect all the information that we've entered so far, the specific embedded emissions for all goods that you sell on the market, for all CBAM goods that you sell on the market. And tell the template for the specific types of products identified by the CN codes, what are the associated embedded emissions. And this is done by selecting, in the first column, selecting the relevant production process. In this case, it's very simple. We just have one production process, which is the bubble approach. So we select that here, which will automatically tell us this is the type of aggregated good iron and steel products. And specific for the iron and steel products, the column CN codes will only be populated with CN codes that fall under that specific CBAM good category. So here you have to make sure that you enter the correct 8-digit CN code for the respective product you want to export. Let's use, for example, the 17208 1000. And the template, for simplicity and for transparency, will help you by showing automatically the definition of that specific CN code to make sure you don't enter anything incorrectly. The next column is just for you to help you communicate with the importer into the EU and give a specific product name. This is completely free to you what you want to use, but use something that you probably also put on invoices so that the importer into the EU is easy for this person to identify which product you are referring to. And if you scroll further to the right, you see that all information regarding the specific embedded emissions, direct and indirect and total, are shown here automatically based on the entries we've done in previous sheets. It also shows you that 0% of the attributed emissions were default values. It's all of information that has been reported by you, the operator of the installation. So it's all actual emissions of your installation. It also shows the source of the electricity emission factor. You remember we entered it was a mix of electricity produced on-site and imported from the grid. And last but not least, to cap off the embedded emissions, the importer will need to know the embedded electricity, which is 0.346, also automatically calculated. And as you can see on the sheet, summary processes, and this caps off this information. But we're not completely done yet. You are asked to also provide information which are called the so-called qualifying parameters. So the main reducing agent that is used can be selected for iron and steel products, whether it's coal or coke, natural gas, biogas, or hydrogen. It was coal or coke. And the next step is to select the steel mill identification number. Again, here and for all other parameters, in case you don't know what exactly that is, please click on the link on the top of the sheet, which will guide you to the sheet further guidance, which explain in more detail what's behind the specific data that has to be entered here and the definition of steel mill or the main reducing agent and so on. And then further to the right, you see you're asked to provide information about the specific content of certain compounds like manganese, chromium, nickel, and so on. If you read carefully the implementing act and its annexes and the guidance document, you will see that those are only relevant if they exceed 5%. And that's why here in the template, they are displayed as optional. But in case you want to enter them, even if they are below 5%, something like 4.5, you see that's exactly how it would work. Very, very simple. And last but not least, scroll completely to the right. There is further information, again, optional for the transitional period. about the type of carbon price instrument. You can select from the drop-down list information like, is it a carbon tax, a levy, a fee, a emission trading system, or a combination? The share of the embedded emission that are affected by that carbon price, in which currency, what is the carbon price that has been paid, and last but not least, the amount of rebate, such as a tax deduction, free allocation, financial compensation of other means, or a combination of things. And as a result, last but not least, you will see the difference between the carbon price that needs to be paid and the type of rebate, how much carbon price has been paid per ton of that specific product, but that I will briefly show you an example in the second example, which we will speak about in a minute. So now we've completed everything in the template. And the last thing you can do or want to do is to look at that sheet summary communication. This is the minimum information that the import entity you needs in terms of identifying everything related to the import of the CBAM good. And there's a special feature about that sheet compared to the summary products, and that is that it's always in English language. So all headers, all parameters are always shown in English language, unless you have entered, of course, in your national language, any free text. So this is the sheet at the very minimum that you have to send to the importer of the EU. You may as well send the whole template, but this is the minimum information. And I will show you what would be the best way if you just want to send this specific sheet to the importer of the EU. The simple way is to open a new template or a new Excel file, an empty one. You copy everything that is in this sheet by selecting Control A and selecting Control C. And go to the new sheet, click on the right mouse click and enter values. But this will not be in a very appealing format. So again, click right on the mouse and paste all the format. And you're good to go. Everything now in the template is no longer linked via formulae to the other template. It's all contained here as text. So you have just to save that file, send it to the importer, and you're good to go.
The second example that we want to demonstrate is described in section 7222 of the guidance for operators. It is again a steel plant, but this time producing high alloy steels in an electric arc furnace or EAF process, where different grades of scrap are the main input. For meeting exact alloy grades, this steel plant purchases ferroalloys from other producers. In this example here, we will focus on how to enter the relevant information on purchased precursors into the template, while assuming that the rest has been already sufficiently explained in the first example. When we look at the process diagram, the first thing we notice is that the product of the first production process, the crude steel slabs, are sold on the market. Therefore, it is not possible to apply the bubble approach as in the previous example. Instead, a second production process after the crude steel production is needed, which is the process for producing iron and steel products. Like in the first example, further differentiation within this second process is not required for all the different production units that are covered by this process. In this example, we see furthermore that the CN code is not the only, not sufficient information for characterizing a CBAM good. For example, very different alloy grades can be products within the same CN code. Therefore, Annex 4 of the Implementing Act requires the reporting of such qualifying parameters. The CBAM Transitional Registry contains the relevant input fields depending on the CBAM goods category, and so does the communication template. It provides space in sheet summary products to enter the alloy grade and its other qualifying parameters that the importer will then need to fill the CBAM quarterly report. For completeness, this is mentioned that other inputs such as natural gas will be relevant for this example, but our main focus here will be on the purchased precursors.
And we again start with sheet A of the template, although in this example, we don't want to go through the whole template together, but start with an almost completely pre-filled template and just point you to the most relevant differences when facing a situation where you cannot apply a bubble approach, but split the production into several production processes, and where also purchase precursors are relevant. Because here you have to absolutely make sure that there are no gaps and no double counting between the production processes. So each ton of CO2 is only attributed to one specific production process, and you make sure that anything else is not containing any gaps or double counting. So let's move on. Here we start with the pre-filled list. We're producing crude steel and iron and steel products within the installation, and we produce the crude steel via the electric arc furnace, as you see in the small window. So the next step is, again, as in the first example, to identify how do we want to report things. And here we cannot apply the bubble approach, but we have to report them separately as part of the EAF products are entering the market. So what we do is we select the crude steel, and we don't select the iron and steel products here as they're not part of the production process, and indicate it's just the direct production. So nothing else other than the crude steel. And for completeness, it doesn't matter if you enter your only direct products or the crude steel. Again, it's just important to indicate that nothing else other than crude steel is part of that production process. Next, then we have to select the iron and steel products. Again, only the direct production. And for completeness, we enter again a name that makes it unique for us to reference later. So we're good here. And in contrast to the previous example, as you can still see on the screen, this time purchase precursors are relevant. The template is already pre-filled, as the way how you fill in the production processes is very similar to production processes within the installation. But here you have to enter on top the country code of the country from which this specific product is imported from. And as previously for your production processes within the installation, you have to select the route. So again, just as a summary, under section 4, you have to report all production processes that are produced within the installation, and here under section 5, all relevant precursors that have been purchased and produced outside the installation. Once this is done, you have completed sheet A for this example too. And let's move on with sheet D of the example and complete the information that we've already pre-filled here for the production processes within the installation. This is important information because now we have a significant difference compared to the first example where we had the bubble approach. Because not all of the 2.2 million tons of steel that are produced in that production process are further processed into iron and steel products, but some of those enter the market. And if you look at the table in the small window, you see it's exactly 1,007,000 tons of steel that are produced for the market. So just a small share. The rest, and this is important, is going into the production process, the roll milling and finishing the iron and steel product. Why is that important? Because all the emissions that you attribute to this specific production processes will carry on to the rolling mill and finishing. So when you enter the 1.2 million tons of CO2 that are consumed of EAF products by the rolling mill and finishing, all the embedded emissions that are associated with that 1.2 million tons will be attributed to the other process. And that's why it's important not to double count emissions. If you see further below, we've already entered information here regarding all the emissions that are attributed to the electric arc furnace, including the continuous casting. And we can move on with the roll mill and finishing as the template indicates, because their entries are not yet completed, indicated by the red color. So we can click on that red color and scroll further below. Again, this information, as you see, has been pre-filled. In this case, it's very similar to our bubble approach. All of the products that are produced in the installation are sold as CBAM goods to the market. So nothing further needs to be done here with respect to the production, but important when you attribute the emissions further down below. You see, we've only filled it partly. One entry is still missing. And this is the directly attributable emissions. And this directly attributable emissions only contain the natural gas emissions that go into that process. All emissions that go into the production process of electric arc furnace, you should not attribute here, because this we've already done in the previous step by indicating in the template that those 1.2 million tons of electric arc furnace products have been further processed. So that will tell the template automatically that all these emissions are carried on and forward here to the finishing process. So it's only the 402,245 tons of CO2, which you see in the table, that need to be attributed here. Again, you see there is no longer any red color indicator, so we have completed successfully sheet D for the second example. And now we can move on to sheet E. You will see that sheet E looks very, very similar to sheet D. This is because the purchase precursor system boundaries are exactly the same as for the production processes within the installation. It's just a slightly different way of reporting it. And that's what I want to show to you. You see, it's already filled with the information that 80,540 tons of carbon steel ingots have been imported as purchase precursor to the installation. As a next step, you have to assign this figure to how much is going into the production of the electric arc furnace directly and how much is going into the final products. So as a first step, those imported purchase precursors are not going into the final product, but they are going into the first production process, the electric arc furnace. So all of the production has to be attributed to that production. And now you have completed this specific section. And just to summarize, what you've now told the template in sheet E is that those 80,000 tons have been consumed within the system boundaries of the electric arc furnace. All associated emissions with the carbon steel ingots will therefore be attributed with the electric arc furnace. And as we've entered in sheet D, all emissions with the electric arc furnace The embedded emissions all will go to the rolling mill and finishing to the extent the electric arc furnace products are not placed on the market. So the final step for the precursor is to attribute the emissions. You see this section is a lot shorter and simpler than for the production process. So for products that you produce within the installation, here you just have to enter the final figures, which, if you look at the table, are 1.48 tons of CO2 per ton of carbon steel ingot, and you have to enter the source of that value, whether it's a measured value, so it's information that you have been provided with from your supplier, so the connected installation that produced that steel ingot from which you have purchased this product, or whether you used a default value here. So let's assume you got the information from your supplier, which should already raise the question, how can the supplier know exactly that it was 1.48? And this should already ring a bell. And this means, in the ideal case, in order to collect this information from your supplier, you should send this communication template, an empty one, to your supplier and ask the operator of that carbon and steel ingots to fill a template for this specific installation. This will result in the final result of 1.48 tons of CO2, and you can use that result as an input for your specific template. So ideally, you have a chain of traceable reports along the whole supply chain from all purchased precursors up to your installation, and just add your emissions in your installations on top of everything to add up to the embedded emissions. That would be the ideal scenario, how to collect this information from suppliers. As a last step for this specific purchase precursor is to identify the indirect emissions, which are very similar to what we said previously. You need to enter the specific electricity consumption. If we look at the table, it's 0.245 megawatt hours per ton, and the emission factor is 0.833 tons CO2 per megawatt hours. Again, we are asked about where did we get this information from? Was it measured or is it a default value? Again, we say this is information we have obtained from the supplier. And for the electricity emission factor, like for production processes in the installation, you have the same list where you got that information from. Whether it's default value or it's an actually measured value, again, you may just click on the link to the further guidance to show you what's behind those abbreviations. Select the appropriate one from the list. You see everything is green now. All other purchase precursors we've already pre-filled. They will look very similar to this one if you look at the example. And by this, we have finished the entries in sheet E of the second example. And now that we filled the template, we can again look at the summary processes sheet in order to identify whether all entries that we've made look good or whether there have been any gaps or double counting. I don't want to repeat what we've seen in the first example. You see again here a summary of everything that we've entered in the previous sheet. But I want to point your attention specifically to the added value of the detailed overview. So click on that link or scroll below to see specifically for this final product, the rolling mill and finishing. Because in contrast to the first example where we had a bubble approach where it doesn't look so fancy here you get all the information that is necessary or helpful for you to double check whether you've entered everything correctly. What can you see in that table? You see, first of all, here in section 2, that we're speaking about your final product, your CBAM good that you're exporting. And The relevant precursors are the direct production of the rolling mill and finishing process, and all precursors starting from the other production process in your installation, the electric arc furnace, and all purchased precursors, the steel ingots, and all alloys that have gone into the electric arc furnace. The next column shows you the mass share. So this 1.083 means it's 1.083 tons of electric arc furnace products per ton of final product, following by 0.039 tons of carbon steel ingots per ton of iron and steel products. And this is important because you see then in the next columns, like the share of default values, which is just 3%, as you will see when you look at the template and the filled-in example. But the important part here is the columns all referring to specific embedded emissions, the direct one, the indirect one, the totals, and the absolute. So not per ton of product, but the total CO2. And in all of these 6 columns, those figures are additive. Additive means, for example, for the ferronickel, the 0.504 tons of CO2 are not a value per ton of ferronickel, it's per ton of final product. So if you calculate the sum of all these, you see it's 1.44, which is exactly what the template shows you here. So this allows you for the whole supply chain to identify the biggest contributor to the total specific embedded emissions of the product for the direct, the indirect, and the total emissions. And same applies on the right-hand side for the embedded electricity expressed in megawatt hours per ton. Also, you see the biggest contributor to that is the electric arc furnace, contributing more than 0.7 megawatt hours per ton of iron and steel product. On the right-hand side, you see also a summary of the carbon price due, but that I will show you in a moment when we speak about something we haven't talked before, which is the sheet F, which contains 2 tools which can further help you for specific cases. But other than that, the rest, the summary of products and the summary communication will be very identical to what we've discussed in the first example. We don't need to repeat here. And with that, you would be good to go and have completed the template for the second example. And just as a goodie at the end, let's look at the tools sheet to see how this can help you further. So now we've switched to the sheet F tools, which contains, as said before, 2 useful tools or potentially useful tools, which can help you for filling in information somewhere else in the template. The first is a tool for the cases where you have a cogeneration of heat and electricity, or as it is also called, a combined heat and power unit. The perfect example would be a gas turbine where you have a heat recovery and the recovered heat is producing steam, and the steam is then converted via a steam turbine into electricity. And the question is, how do you attribute the emission of the fuel that go into the gas turbine into emissions associated with heat, which would be part of the direct emissions, and emissions that have to be attributed to electricity, which are part of indirect emissions. And this can be done with that template, with that specific tool of that template, which is exactly performing the calculation steps as you will see in the guidance document. So I just use an arbitrary example of inputs. So the amount of fuel that goes into the CHP, let's assume it's 1,000 terajoule of coal that goes into the CHP, and 600 terajoules are of heat in terms of steam are produced and are either used in industrial processes within your installation or exported somewhere else. Then you need to enter the electricity that is output of the CHP in megawatt hours. Be careful, the template will then convert it into terajoules. So let's assume it's something like 50,000 megawatt hours, and you will see it's 180 terajoules. The next step is to list all the greenhouse gas emissions. If we say it's coal, for example, it will be something of an emission factor of 96 or something tons of CO2 per terajoule. So that would amount to 96,000 tons of CO2, and including any emissions from flue gas screening. So for example, for DNOx or anything else, or for desulfurization. So let's say on top of that, that would be 2,500 tons of CO2. Then you see a summary of the efficiencies. So in total, there's a total efficiency of the CHP of 78%. 60% of the energy is converted into heat, 18% into electricity. Then you see already pre-filled, there are reference efficiency for standalone plants. So for coal products, that would be 88% in a standalone unit producing heat, and 44.2% in a standalone unit producing electricity. You can see the relevant reference efficiency in the Implementing Act, more specifically in Annex 9 thereof. Here, the template already pre-fills it for the standard case of coal. And as a result, you see the attributable emissions to heat. So of the total emissions that we have identified above, this between 95 and 100,000 as a result, those are attributed as 61,667 tons of CO2 are to be attributed to heat production, which is expressed or converted into 102.78 tons CO2 per terajoule of heat, which is steam. And conversely, the other remaining emissions, 36,833 roughly, those are attributed to electricity production. And by that, you've understood and see how the tool for splitting emissions between heat and electricity, how that cogeneration tool can help you with that. And lastly, the final tool and the second tool that you will see in the template is a tool that helps you with calculating the carbon price that has already been paid or is due to the production process, and any rebate that has already been granted for the specific production. So what you see at the bottom is a big table which already shows some familiar information to you. It lists all the production processes in your installation and all the purchased precursors. So the first thing you have to do is convert everything into a relevant currency. So you can, for example, also enter here in US dollars. The next step is the share of the specific embedded emissions that are affected by that carbon price. That will show, expressed in tons CO2 per ton, how much of that total emissions, specific emissions, are affected by a carbon price. And then you can enter the carbon price that needs to be paid under specific carbon pricing instruments and the amount of rebate. So to give you a specific example, let's assume you are located in a country that is not subject to carbon pricing yet, but you have imported this ferrochromium alloy from an installation where 100% of the emissions are subject to a carbon price. And let's say that carbon price in that country, you can demonstrate that over the reference period, it was $50 per ton of CO2. So what you will see automatically is not only will the 50 US dollars per ton of CO2 be displayed because you've entered it, but because of the amount of ferrochromium that goes into the production of electric arc furnace and the amount of electric arc furnace products that go into the production of the iron and steel products, the template will automatically calculate the carbon price that is due per ton of electric arc furnace product and per ton of roll milling and finishing for this specific production process. And those three columns, the carbon price due per ton of CBAM good, the rebate per ton of CBAM good, and the resulting difference between those figures. Those you can enter in the summary product sheet as shown in the previous example on the right-hand side, and that will be exactly the information that is needed to identify the carbon price, the net effective carbon price that was due. And by that, you're done finishing the template.
We have reached the end of our training. The key takeaway should be the understanding how the template is a great help in the CBAM process. Firstly, it helps the operator of an installation in presenting all relevant information in a structured and transparent manner. Secondly, it also helps in the calculations wherever possible. Thirdly, it helps the importers in collecting the data they need for reporting. We once more invite you to make use of the Commission's website on the CBAM to look up the newest information. For example, the template examples we showed here and this presentation in case you want to come back to specific topics. Finally, we invite you, in case you detect errors or bugs in the template, to please send a short notice thereof to the email address displayed here. We hope you enjoyed watching this video and that it helps you in the use of our template. Goodbye.